Hello. Welcome everyone to the Forgotten OneCast. I am your host, CJP, and today we're going to be talking progressive rock, prog rock, nerd rock, art rock, whatever you want to call it. It's just ethereal goodness from the gods. And today I wanted to introduce to those who haven't seen him on his own shows, only Talk and Roll, That 70s Rock Fan. How are we doing, sir?
Well, good evening to you, sir. Good to see you. You know, there are purists who would dispute your connection of art rock and prog rock. So let's talk about that for an hour. No, sorry.
Well, there are two schools of thought when it comes to
scholars once said. You know, that's the beauty of this genre. It's the beauty of the genre. Yeah.
And we do have someone else joining us. Would you like to introduce this gentleman?
I will. So a great friend of mine and of my channel, and also a man who's got his own channel called the Rock N Roll Rowdies, him and a bunch of his disreputable friends who are all former roadies and tour managers. Mr. Alan Grange is with us.
Mr. Alan, how are we doing today?
We cannot quite hear you, sir. You're which is preferable normally that is the case. You're doing a Wilco. He's pulling a Wilco on us because we had a show earlier and Wilco was the same. So while you sort that out, I should point out to people that Alfie Noakes isn't his name. It's Alan Grange. That's a comedic reference to Peter Cook and Dudley Moore.
I actually know who they are.
Yeah. No, still can't hear you, sir. So if you go and click on the settings button and then try that, we'll see if we can figure you out. But so yeah, so Alan or Granny as he's known, and that's not because he liked the older ladies. I think that's just because his name's Grange. Alan, I will introduce as a man who, in the 1970s particularly, road managed for many progressive rock bands, including Vandergraaf Generator, King Crimson, Stackridge, and some other band that I can't remember the name of, beginning with G. And also at that time, of course, encountered and toured with those bands, toured with Genesis, many other bands who are seminal progressive rock bands. So I thought it'd be nice for Granny to come and join us. And he is going to do the show by smoke signals today.
But
you should pop out, Alan, and then come back in. Yeah, and come back in. Yeah.
Oh.
There we go. So yeah, hopefully we'll get him back in one piece. Older people, what can you expect? You know?
Technology is not our friend.
Yeah, so Granny is, as I say, steeped in the actual touring history of those bands, having worked with many of them. He's forever reeling off, and it's not even that he may have roadied for many of them, but it's also the fact that these were bills with 2 or 3 other bands of that era. Yes, Genesis, whatever. So I thought it'd be nice to get his perspective. But yeah. So where do you want to begin, sir? Because this is a subject that is enormous.
It is.
Where do we begin with such a subject?
You know, in really, you know, I'll start with kind of where I came from in this genre. My dad. A lot of my musical taste comes from my parents. My mom was mainly, sock hop, 50s, early 60s. You know, that's really where her taste lied. Whereas my dad was more, psychedelic, acid, southern rock, prog rock, jazz fusion of all things. He was like Passport and things like that. Into back in the 70s. But Yes was a staple of my childhood. Growing up, I don't know how many times I heard Fragile as a kid growing up. Yes album and Fragile were the two that was his go-tos.
It's incredible, mate. It's an incredible education for a kid to have parents that were into that. I admire you and I envy you because I'm probably more the age of your father. I had to discover this stuff for myself because my parents were of a generation before that. And,
right.
This was just an alien landscape to them. And I must admit, as a young kid, it was that way to me. My introduction probably would be, I was born in 1963. So my introduction to the more progressive side of rock music would come with it. Early listening to the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, Strawberry Fields, and then a little bit later stuff like that. That was more the Who I started to get into in the early 70s, and then the more progressive leanings of those bands. So I went from being a guy who's into hard rock and pop, let's face it, because you're a kid, to discovering this other stuff. Hearing a Genesis album like Selling England by the Pound and going, okay, that's different. And at first, well, maybe I want to dismiss this because it's not 3 minutes long and full of flashing guitars. Wait a minute, there's something going on in here. So that kind of introduction,
Can we hear you this time, sir?
Oh, no. Oh, Granny. We
broke
can't hear
it.
you, mate. Sorry about that, mate. We can't hear you. Maybe have you tried a different browser? Right, 3 browsers.
3 different ones? Good Lord.
Yeah. Okay, he's going to try on the phone. Yeah.
Okay. We'll see you in a bit here, Alan.
See you in a bit, yeah. See, that man used to keep bands on stage with sticky tape and gaffer tape or whatever, and so I am indeed older than many people on the internet. I'm one of the oldest people on the internet. So it was interesting I'm glad you got introduced to it by someone else, because for me it was kind of a struggle finding it on my own.
Yeah, and then again, in college, my faculty advisor, who was also the guy, he was my private tutor in percussion as I was going through music school, really introduced me to a lot more of the genre than I had been introduced to, just from my parents.
Yeah.
And of course, that's my daughter. She had to say hi.
Oh, hi. I hope you're raising her the right way too by playing some good music.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We've been listening to Prism for the last week or so in my car, which is a great fusion band from Japan.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I know Prism. Yeah. I'm aware of them. I can't say I've got a lot of their material, but this is the beauty of the genre that came to be known as progressive rock, is that it's people think of it as that are not into it. It's a very narrow thing. Oh, it's just a bunch of guys with noodling about on stage with classical stuff. It's nothing, and there is a bit of that, but it's a very broad church. You've bands that have come from a folk background, from a jazz background, from a rock background, classical. It's all in there, and different bands mixed it up in different ways. I think if there was to be a unifying factor for me in what we call progressive rock, it was that these were guys that were not nihilists like, say, the punks. I've got a lot of punk and seen a lot of punk bands. I love it, but they wanted to be better musicians all the time, and they wanted to play more intricate music. And it's probably become the classical music of our era, of the late 20th century.
It really has.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about Yes and Fragile and other albums like that. And I have to be honest and say Yes are probably not in my top 5 progressive bands. I've seen them live and I've got lots of their albums. Again, it's different tastes. There's different bands with different styles. That is akin to the classical music experience. This is what they were trying to create, I think, putting words in their mouth. Something that was lasting and eternal and had musicianship. Sometimes insane musicianship.
Chris Squire, I don't know what God blessed him with the ability to not only play those bass lines that he played, but also to be able to sing such incredible backups vocals at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, I can barely play guitar and sing at the same time.
Right. Granny, speak.
No, I'm talking now.
Oh,
I'm back to my trusty iPad, which seems to always work. So I hope I ruin that incredible introduction. Brian gives such good introductions.
Yeah, I'm like a progressive rock band. The introduction lasts for 10 minutes.
So I'm trying really hard not to have the up the nose camera angle, but I'm really
hold it like this. That's it. We can't
working it the best I can. Hope
Yeah.
you can hear me right.
You're a little bit quiet, but at least we can see you, and
I
that's the
will
main
come
thing.
closer, then you can't see me. Okay.
Yeah, so I was introducing you, given your body of work with many of the legends of progressive rock in the UK, King Crimson, Van der Graaf Generator, Stack Ridge, bands that are probably slightly less known in North America, perhaps, but we're on that scene with the guys like Genesis and Yes and so on. There's another band I can't remember though.
Oh, surely they were like chart toppers. They were legends in their own borough.
Yeah.
Actually, a wonderful, virtually unknown group called Gnidrolog. Gnidrolog, which is a rearrangement of the brothers Goldring is their last name.
Yeah.
So a wonderful little band. My first professional gig.
Yeah. So if CJ, if you don't mind sharing those, CGP,
oh, yes.
You don't mind sharing these images. This is Gnidrolog.
Yep.
Alan's first professional gig as a roadie, and they appeared at the Royal Albert Hall, amongst other places.
We did the Royal Festival, the Royal Albert Hall. We played one of the first major outdoor rock festivals in England. I just found out recently, 1971, they couldn't hold the Isle of Wight Festival, so they had the Wheelie Festival, which is what we were on.
Oh, that's why they did the Wheelie.
I think that's why it was such a big deal.
Yeah, this one. So you were working on festivals like this.
Yeah.
And if you look at the lineup, as well as Gnidrolog being somewhere down the bottom of the bill, you had bands like Colosseum, sort of jazz rock progressive bands, Curved Air, you had Van der Graaf Generator, Caravan, Barclay James Harvest. So really the I hate to use the word Genesis because of the band, but the origins of progressive rock as a movement in the UK were really in this era that you were working.
Oh, it was magic. I mean, we didn't quite make it onto that poster, but we're on another version. And we were on at 9 a.m., and we weren't the first ones on. There was, I think one band went on at 3 in the morning. But that was my second professional gig.
Yeah. So incredible. Yeah, I know there's pictures of you on the stage grinning like a whatever as a kid, but you were doing, there was stuff like this, with Gnidrolog and Van der Graaf Generator, Genesis.
Gnidrolog, bottom right.
We know that the sort of blues rock and heavy rock scenes were beginning to flourish too, but progressive rock, it was not a niche, it was a dominant form at the time.
Yeah, I mean, we grew up on Jeff Beck and that kind of thing, and then Led Zeppelin came in. Jeff Beck was always my personal favorite. Thank you, Jeff. And then in London, it was just a remarkably fertile scene. You didn't have to go anywhere fancy to see a fascinating band. Like it'd be a pub with a music room, and be some amazing band that went on to possibly do well. Like it spawned all kinds of artists. And humble beginnings, but great atmosphere, great fertile ground,
Yeah, I mean, bands like that became global megastars years later, like Genesis and Yes, were all playing in those clubs in London in that era. And also the guys like the Soft Machine and the Canterbury stuff, Robert Wyatt.
Yeah.
There's one, just to prove that here we go.
Treasured Soft Machine album, the first cover, the center, it rotates. It's like it was so unusual. If you can see it, you kind of rotate the inside. Anyway, you can move the pictures around.
Show that again. I'm still learning how this stuff works. So
I'm trying to see. I'm not used to using.
You gotta go the other way. That's it. There you go.
There we go.
The insert rotates, and you can move the image around. It's just not.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, it goes on. Yeah.
So this was I actually saw this group before I left my hometown of Hartlepool. I saw them in a theatre in the north of England, like an all-night festival in a place called Middlesbrough. Dreary, drab, miserable, working-class coastal port, but they were incredible. Like you can't imagine, like something. They were all Flower Power at the time. It was a very esoteric three-piece, and they just stood out.
I just had one more picture I wanted to share that I've shared my screen with, which is to prove that Granny is not lying, and he was indeed Gnidrolog's roadie with the drum. That's all he ever carried though, because he was a 9-stone weakling. So
that's right. Well, I was in charge of the drummer's oboe. Don't forget.
The drummer's oboe. The drummer was an oboe player too, which is another trait of progressive rock. And I think you could probably divide prog into two camps: those who had woodwind players and those who didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of my favorite albums that my dad had me listen to when I was a kid was, and I just mainly because of the cover.
Oh, Gentle Giant.
I was going to mention them actually. Yeah,
Yeah.
you probably
is, when you pull out the album, it's got the cutouts.
Yeah. Everything was so creative. Everything, the album covers, the gatefolds, the inserts. The record companies didn't really want to do it. I'm sure people had to be persuaded to have this experimental stuff. It was all very experimental.
Yeah, it wasn't, as you say, Granny, it wasn't just the music. Everything about it was experimental. The lighting rigs and the sound, the album covers, the inlays, the promotional posters. Yeah. Everything about it was, let's see if we can make this even better and bigger and more wonderful, and all on a shoestring, of course.
Yeah. Well, I joke with Brian that originally it was groups, but when they started in London, they became bands, and everything was a little bit more gravitas.
Yeah,
bands. Taken more seriously, and the music was beginning to be taken seriously by the critics. And
it was no longer a 3-minute Moon June whatever. And I was still, in 1972, I was barely 9 years old, so I was still listening to the likes of Slade and Mud and the Status Quo and the 3-minute rock stuff and the pop hits. Yeah. As I was saying, it took me a little while to get into hearing those things the right way, because you have to listen to them right away. It's not, I'm going to listen to that 3-minute hit on the radio. You got to put the album on and sit and listen to it.
Yeah. I always thought that was an asset. I loved the taking the album cover down. You're preparing yourself, like making a good cup of tea. You take your time. You take the album carefully out of its sleeve. You dust it off. You put it gently onto the turntable. And then if you had the right turntable, you could drop the needle. And the whole thing was preparing it. And then, yes, you listened exactly between the speakers, the stereo effect. It's fantastic. Yeah. I like everything about that period.
It's beautiful. I love it. Triple albums. When do you get triple albums?
Look at that.
Yeah. Nice. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Now you've got a picture that you sent me of that on stage.
Did I?
Yeah, you sent me a picture. I think they were at Wheelie or one of the festivals too, and that Tarkus thing was on the stage.
It didn't work. I don't think it worked. It might have been Mal. I think Mal might have been the one.
Somebody sent me that. Yeah, I'm going to look for it, but keep talking.
Yeah. It's amazing. Brian's got such a catalogue of, we never know what he's going to pop up.
I'm just listening because this is all just fascinating to me. Well, being younger, I didn't get to see a lot of these bands in their heyday because I was, still just a twinkle in my dad's eye at that point.
Yeah.
So luckily your dad came onto them as a latecomer to a lot of these groups.
It's lucky your dad's eye was twinkling then. That's a good thing.
Yeah. Otherwise I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, I'm going to find that Tarkus stage set. So
yeah,
you guys talk amongst yourselves.
I don't even remember how I got a hold of this, but this is still sealed.
Yeah,
it's
Rush.
Hold your fire by Rush, but it's actually still a sealed record.
Nice.
Yeah, look at that. I have a couple like that. Yeah.
So there's a rare example, though, of a band that's considered progressive directly coming from outside the UK, because I have to say, and all the Americans listening, forgive me, that prog rock was largely started as a UK thing, I think.
Yes.
Not that there weren't American influences, but largely UK. And Rush, maybe Blue Oyster Cult is another example, were bands that were outside of that came directly from North America, and they were both quite spacey bands as well. More like a space rock end of the progressive, like with Hawkwind as well would be another example.
Hawkwind were very spacey.
Yeah.
You had to be very careful at their gigs what you drank.
Yeah, well, you might get thrown out of the band if you took the wrong type of drugs. That was
You might, yeah. You might get a psychedelic surprise.
yeah.
What's up, DJ Access? How you doing? So what's up? So 70s progressive rock was a bit before my time, but my dad was huge into it and had a pretty sizable record collection back in the day.
You know, just if I can interpret, there's a band here that real connoisseurs of the 60s like scene would know bands like The Action. They were a mod
band, yeah.
mod outfit, but they crossed over to progressive and they became Mighty Baby.
Wow.
A very psychedelic album cover for its time and extended suites of music. So established artists were all like trying to make, like probably after Sgt. Pepper, everybody wanted to make concept albums, and because it was very fertile. Everywhere you went, you'd hear something interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's I'd forgotten about that band. There's so many bands that are forgotten because you've got the big ones that made it: Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, Yes,
Rush,
Rush, slightly later, but Rush are regarded as the long-lasting ones, I guess. But there's dozens of other great bands that were there up and down there, and that some of them never heard of again. But they made the most fascinating music. I think we've talked about some of the ones, Granny, that you worked with, King Crimson, who had a big reputation, not necessarily commercially huge all the time. Van der Graaf Generator. These were enormously influential bands in that scene, doing different stuff. And you worked with both of those guys. I mean, they were quite far out there.
It was intimidating because I never very technical. I always say we were willing and we would make it work, but it was a little intimidating to work with people like Robert Fripp. And then the Van der Graaf Generator guys were very nice about it, but I hadn't really even seen a Hammond organ close up. And all of a sudden I'm setting one up and transporting it along with all this other stuff. And I'm just had to go every day, learned a bit more. And so I'm very grateful that these people let us in because we had no qualifications.
Yeah, the Hammond organ plays an enormous role in prog. And I guess that and the Moog are the two things. There's tons of Hammond and tons of Moog.
Yeah.
I guess those wrangling those Hammonds around must have been good for the muscles.
Well, it wasn't good for your hernia, though. As it happens, I'm very well preserved considering the stuff we did. We had to muscle that Hammond organ sometimes in the most ridiculous situations. A gig in Rome was 120 flights, 120 steps down, and then the stage was 8 feet high, and getting it in and out was just torture.
Yeah, that would be with Van der Graaf Generator, who had They were riots in Italy. They were superstars in Italy.
That was crazy time.
Yeah, they had a riot. That was the Tarkus. Sorry, that was the Tarkus stage setting at the Oval.
We got a question from my bass player in Tulsa. This is time for a real question, Mr. Allen. Compare the 70s backstage to the 80s backstage, and what was the most outrageous thing that you witnessed?
Well, we can't name names, but
well, obviously, and of course we are on YouTube.
That's true. Now, I used to any tour manager worth his salt. Any tour manager worth his salt would have a laminating machine. So you'd have like let me get this right. Warner Brothers, all area access, right? But on the back of mine would have a picture of Joseph Haydn, the 18th century composer. That was my, and so you'd have like Little Walter, the famous, beautiful blues harmonica player. And these people backstage, they wanted these. That was what would you do for a backstage pass? So, I mean, there was this one lady, she was pestering me and pestering me and pestering me for a pass, and she was a friend of the promoter, I think. And you kind of tolerated promoters because they were necessary evil. So this one woman was going on, and so I made her a backstage pass, but with a difference. I can't show you it on YouTube.
Right.
It's a very close-up photograph of certain part of an anatomy and a rubber duck.
Oh, right.
Plastic rubber duck. And she didn't notice it. I put the pass on backwards, so she just saw the logo.
Right.
About 5 minutes later, she came running back, screaming, and slapped me in the face because everybody had suddenly seen this very erotic picture. So she never asked me for any more passes.
It's very naughty, very naughty.
That was the kind of atmosphere. There was a lot of naughtiness, drugs, and hijinks. But
I mean, the bands were nothing compared to the roadies, and I do want to share another photo with your indulgence, or kind host. This is what the roadies looked like in those days. So this is a Granny and Mal, and they're I don't think those shorts could get any shorter.
No. Now, are any of those cucumbers wrapped in tinfoil?
That's what that was. I think they got that idea from this for the movie.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. So that was that was in Wishbone Ash, a Wishbone Ash tour. But you worked with these guys, Van der Graaf Generator. Pawn Hearts is a key album in progressive rock history.
Yeah.
Pete Hamill. Not so much on the guitar. It was more keyboards and wind instruments.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was no guitar in sight, and at the period, everything was guitar solos. They didn't even have a electric guitar. Peter would sometimes play acoustic guitar, but it was more. Maybe you like the energy of it. But it can't. We didn't mic everything up. We didn't have enough mics. Be lucky to cover all the drums, but the main horn player and flute player was Dave Jackson. You can see him there with the black hat.
Well, he's got all the pedals, so he's not just playing it. Yeah. It's they were quite a band, quite the band. Still, I think Pete Hamill's still around. He's still going today.
Yeah.
But they were, that was the British scene in those days, and you would see bills. I mean, this is well before my gig going days. You'd see bills with Genesis, Van der Graaf Generator, Yes, all those bands would be on the same bill. Must have been quite the time. Yeah. And the audience would sit there and listen.
Yeah, well, Genesis used to open up for Van der Graaf Generator. They were the opening act sometimes, so obviously things changed. But Charisma Records was the name of the label, and they were like clever bands. They had clever bands on. Another band called Audience, who had woodwinds in it, of course. Every band had something. So Genesis done the great things, but it was a lot of mix and match. People were meeting everywhere. That was like all you did was music and art.
Well, Genesis had, I mean, Peter Gabriel, little known facet of his oeuvre is he plays the flute. I mean, he all those the flute stuff on the early Genesis albums is Peter Gabriel.
No.
Traffic had a great flute player in the band.
Chris Wood.
Chris Wood, sadly passed away too early from abusing himself. So it's interesting that woodwinds, you'd never get woodwinds in Black Sabbath, but you would get it in a progressive rock band.
There's a live version of Hocus Pocus by Focus on YouTube. And it's basically, I'm wondering what he was on when he was playing, because it had to have been fantastic, because he looked like he was seeing everything all at once. Being able to, yodeling. Who yodels?
Yodeling flute player.
The yodel is much undervalued in rock, I think.
I still have the cassette. I bought the cassette of the album when it came out. I forgot it.
Well, it's interesting because that particular track, Hocus Pocus, did get me and a lot of my contemporaries who were probably at that time more like 11 years old into more progressive stuff, because that was a hit. But it had all these weird things in it, and we were like, well, that's different. I mean, that's not a guy just playing the guitar, although it's got a killer guitar riff.
Oh, that may be one of my favorite riffs ever written. Because John Ackerman just shreds that Les Paul, and he's doing bends and things I never thought you could pull off on that particular type of guitar.
Yeah. That track is lethal. It's a lethal track, and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. It's incredible. Yeah.
But I think them and Golden Earring, that's Belgium and Holland, I think they're the countries on. And it was the music didn't cross the channel. You had French acts that were super huge in France, but they couldn't do anything in England. And I think the rock and roll took a long time to really get a homegrown thing in Europe. At the beginning, there was only a handful of bands like Focus and Golden Earring were like the first couple that I could think of that really made an impact.
There's a Greek band that I don't know if either of you guys are aware of, Aphrodite's Child.
I have heard the name, but I don't
with Vangelis was the keyboard player, and Demis Roussos was the singer and bass player. Now, Demis Roussos went on to have a lot of pop hits. You know, the big robes. He was a big guy.
Chariots of Fire. Did he do
Chariots of Fire is Vangelis. Yeah, they had a progressive rock band in the late 60s called Aphrodite's Child.
Yeah.
Very, very good. You should listen if you've never heard them out there. Brilliant band. They made like 3 albums, and I guess Vangelis didn't really want to tour, so he wasn't into touring. That was the end of that. But virtually unheard of outside Greece. Aphrodite's Child, brilliant progressive rock band.
I remember them. Now,
yeah,
I got
brilliant.
I dug out some albums getting ready for this, and
see
if you've ever heard of these.
Magma.
They sing in their own language. I think they're French, but they're all like anarchists, and it's all like, you can imagine, very heavy.
I remember Magma when I used to visit France on holiday. They were popular, yeah.
Oh, there you go,
Yeah.
They were popular.
There was another French band.
I was going to pull some sacrilege because this is actually my favorite Yes album.
Now, that's interesting. Is that the Buggles one?
Yes.
Because I saw that tour. I saw them live on that tour, the drama tour. And I have to say, I quite enjoyed it. I didn't see...
It's a very different flavor because it had a little bit more of an edge than what you were getting, you know, up through Tormato, just because of the difference in Trevor Horn's writing compared to John Anderson. Yeah,
because Trevor Horn at that time was just about to explode as this great producer and songwriter, and I think you saw that on that album and it actually allowed them then to move forward into the hits era they had much later with Trevor Rabin.
Yeah,
it allowed them to change a little bit, but live he sang beautifully live, and he wasn't John Anderson, but he still sang those older stuff really well. I mean, he's Trevor's not really that keen on performing as such.
No.
But now, of course, Jeff Downes went on to be in Asia and has still to this day is a great progressive rock musician. So the Buggles thing kind of that was like a one-off Age of Plastic.
Well, although they did kind of come back in 2011 with Fly From Here. It was mainly drama part 2 because it was stuff that was left over from that album that they didn't record, and some other stuff that Trevor Horn had written, but David Benoit did the vocals.
Oh,
in 2016, Trevor Horn went back and re-recorded all the vocals himself, and then remixed the album, you know, adding some parts in and out after Chris Squire passed, and it's called Fly From Here Return Trip, which I'd never seen that done before, where the producer comes in and re-records all of the lyrics or all of the vocals for an album.
Yeah,
so it's part 2.
I think it's happened in a couple of bands where someone's been thrown out and then somebody else has re-recorded someone's been ejected. And
tonight, see the original King Crimson.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, and with the Buggles, I like the fact that in the video for Video Killed the Radio Star, there's a third person in the video playing with the band. And I didn't know until much, much later that was Hans Zimmer, the composer.
Oh, I didn't realize that was Hans Zimmer.
Yeah,
is he playing the drums? Is he playing the drums? No,
he's playing keyboards.
Oh, he's playing the keyboards. Right.
There's also just playing some, and then there's a third guy also playing keyboards, and that's Hans Zimmer.
Wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know it was Hans Zimmer.
He was quite young.
You've just blown my mind there. Which is what progressive rock is all about. But it's interesting when you look at an act like the Buggles, because Trevor Horn clearly and Jeff Downes clearly loved progressive rock. They grew up listening to that stuff and probably playing in bands that played that. They just took a twist on it and went into this electronic pop. But the influence of the progressive rock is in that electronic pop, because it's not just hammered out. It's carefully thought out songs with really neat production and orchestration. Arrangements is the word I'm looking for. Sorry. And so the influence, and then he went on to produce like Frankie Goes to Hollywood and all these other acts. But I think he infused everything with that sensibility from that point. You know, it wasn't just, I'm going to knock off a hit. He said, I'm going to make something sound different here. Like the Frankie Goes to Hollywood stuff, which they didn't really play on. It was all him. It's all very interesting music when you listen to it. incredible effects and treatments, so great guitar sounds. So prog was a dirty word then, but it was influencing the culture, even though it wasn't seen as cool after punk and new wave, of course. So.
You got to give the early prog rockers a lot of credit, because if you've ever been to England, it's not all Shakespeare and Buckingham Palace. There's some pretty gritty areas, and to be in a band like Yes in a Caftan, singing in a pub in the northeast of England in February, pissing down with rain, and singing the kind of esoteric lyrics, they have to give them they got some cojones, as they say. And they were working without the technology. I mean, you have to imagine, if you were lucky, you might have a Mellotron.
Oh,
you maybe
I remember reading
in their heads. The Beatles had to struggle with 4 tracks and bouncing tracks. So these guys had ideas in their heads that eventually they could do it. But it was amazing.
Yeah, the technology struggled to keep up with their vision, and then the introduction of classical stuff and even orchestras on some recordings is, I think they were trying to be great musicians, which is kind of frowned upon in many periods in rock history. Like, oh God, that's terrible. Who do you think you are? But they were trying to be great musicians, and they left behind a legacy of, you listen to Yes and Genesis, particularly, I find it's the classical music of its era. It's gorgeous.
My favorite band of the time, The Soft Machine, means the body. It's from the William Burroughs book. They were the first electronic rock band to play at the proms, which is the promenade concerts at the Royal Albert Hall. Traditionally all classical music, and of course I was there, and it was super loud. But it was the first time people were beginning to give it real credibility in the press and stuff. They'd stopped making the jokes about it. Couldn't tell if he was a boy or a girl because of his and then this was thinking man's music, and they begrudgingly started to give it credit. That was around that scene. It was great.
Yeah, the Soft Machine are from what they called the Canterbury scene, where there was a bunch of bands.
Yeah,
and they were more pastoral, folky, jazzy, I think, than
the beginning.
Yeah. I remember, and of course, out of that you had Kevin Ayers, and then for Kevin Ayers you got Mike Oldfield, who worked with Kevin Ayers a lot, and Mike Oldfield, who's definitely in my top 5 artists of all time, is to me is a shining example of what you're talking about. They're trying to overcome the limitations of what's in his head, by recording like Tubular Bells, for instance, with like 15, 20 different instruments. He's playing all the parts. It took him months to arrange. He didn't just go into there with a band and knock it out. And it's beautiful.
I mean, doing that, they changed the business, because you needed entrepreneurs like Richard Branson that understood that side of it, that you couldn't always make an album in 2 days. It began to get that. It needed money, and people like Branson maybe were prepared to put the money up, that they could take the time.
Yeah, Tubular Bells made Virgin's fortune for them to start with. Caravan is the other band from that group, that era. Beautiful band, Caravan. Absolutely gorgeous. Snow Goose.
Just thought of something, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
We're talking a lot about 1967, 68. The pop press was in its infancy, really. And so I saw the Soft Machine at this gig, and vaguely remembered they had a drummer with blonde hair, and they were psychedelic. And when I moved to London, there was no albums released, because they were all had to be imported. There was no publicity pictures. And I thought, because Caravan were from Canterbury, there must be the same people all intermingling. It took me years to unravel who was who. The Caravan and Soft Machine did kind of intermingle. But at first, I thought the Caravan guy with the blonde hair must be Robert Wyatt from the Soft Machine. So it was all very unknown quantities. You had to search things out. It wasn't all laid on a plate. You had to go out to the gigs, and otherwise you wouldn't know what was going on.
Well, in the UK particularly, there was zero radio, because you only had Radio 1 and Radio 2 and a couple of independents. So there was nobody who was going to play long-form progressive stuff on the radio. I guess it would be different in the US, though.
It was, especially when FM radio became more viable, because then there was a whole other band of frequencies that these kind of pirate radio stations could take and use. And so you had a lot more independent stations that were playing things that no one else was playing.
Well, they could put a whole album on and not
Yeah.
just play one track and play the whole side of an album. Yeah. Which you have to do. You have to do for some of those progressive albums. It's tough to drop in and out of them, especially when they're 16-minute long tracks. But you know,
right. In spite of Harry's toenail,
that's right.
What would you put in that? You know,
even the preludes last for half an hour. You know,
that's why I thought I should have started the stream with Stravinsky's Firebird, and I didn't think about that.
Oh yeah, well,
because that came out too for years.
Well, there was the other thing, the use of classical music in prog, because a lot of classical stuff was either directly covered, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer did, or they just took classical themes and built it in. Yes, because they were copyright free.
Well, that too.
Well, Keith Emerson did that with the Nice. Keith Emerson was already doing that in the band.
The Nice, yeah. That's one of the earliest prog bands, really, with doing America. Elmer Bernstein or wherever it was. And, Elmer Leonard, that's a writer. Yeah. So you had a few other albums there, CJP.
I did have one more I popped out was, and it's always weird, some people don't really consider Moody Blues prog, but they really kind of kicked off that in America quite a bit. Yeah. It was, Nights and White Satin, that that album, really kind of was the marijuana of prog in America. It was the gateway drug.
It was the over-the-counter marijuana.
Yeah.
The
generic Tylenol.
It is. You're right. There is a debate, and ever since I was a kid, there's been a debate about, are the Moody Blues a progressive rock band or a pop band wearing progressive rock clothing? It is a debate. My answer is usually I don't really care, because if it's good, it's good, and what does it really matter?
Exactly.
I think they were a pop band who very quickly adapted to the progressive change in rock and decided to do something different, and fair play to them for doing that. I think I would include them as a prog band. I don't think they're as hardcore as some of the other ones. They're more in the melodic side of prog.
Well, and then that's the great thing about prog rock is there are different sections of it, because now a band that I started listening to quite a bit in the 2000s was Dream Theater. Oh. And Dream Theater basically took the ideas of Genesis and Yes and Rush and put it into a more metal context. So they were adding a lot more heavier riffs and shredding parts of it, but it was still that nucleus of, we're taking long form music with a rock idiom and just keeping that spirit alive, and then you had Cody and Cambria and a lot of other bands that came out of that kind of new prog metal movement. So prog is still alive in other ways. And then of course you had the electronic side of things with like Tangerine Dream and bands in that sphere. Christopher Franck went on to actually be the composer for the show Babylon 5, using his knowledge of what he was doing with the keyboards with Tangerine Dream and actually being able to translate that into a soundtrack for a sci-fi show, which makes perfect sense.
You mentioned Tangerine Dream. That's a German band. Yeah, that's another example of European prog.
There was a few. Can was another, I think.
Can, Gong. Were they Gong were French or something, weren't they?
The connection there was the Soft Machine guitarist was from Australia, and he had some sort of drug bust in his history, and they wouldn't let him back into England. So he stayed in France and formed the band Gong. And so there was a mixture.
Australia is a fictional country. There's no such place. Everyone on YouTube knows that.
It's the same for Ohio here in the States.
That's right. It doesn't exist. Those are the Enid. There's a band. They're not European, British. There's another example of an overlooked prog band, the Enid. I love the Enid. Their version of the Dam Busters March is epic. Land of Hope and Glory as well. They do great. So there was like 18 of them on stage, and they were just awesome. Space rock, brilliant band. There's so many of these great bands like that.
Yeah. Even ones that kind of stayed more on the pop side of things. I kind of consider Sparks a progressive band, just because of the insanity of what they were trying to do with these different albums.
Oh, I loved Sparks.
Their ingenuity.
them. We did some gigs with them.
Kimono My House, great. I love those albums.
Great album.
I do love Sparks deeply, and goes back to the thing we talked about earlier on, which is the art rock, prog rock thing. There was a strand of bands, Roxy Music being one of them, Do the Strand. They were considered art rock, but really they were kind of an offshoot of progressive. They were somewhere between progressive and rock. Sparks would be a great example of that. And they had progressive leanings, but within a slightly more rock structure, I think.
They were theatrical from what I remember. A little bit more presentation, like Bowie, the way Bowie changed and became a lot of body language.
B-52s, I'd throw in that kind of group. They were more towards the art rock side, but there was, a bit of that prog madness.
I think you could consider anybody that's trying to do something moving their music forward, not necessarily music as a whole, their music forward could be considered progressive, just trying to not do the same thing every record, every album, but trying to do something different, trying to bring in a new sound, learning their instrument more, God forbid,
and I always like the what if questions. Because I remember reading that at one point, Hendrix was planning on doing something with Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Yeah, they really needed a guitar player, in my opinion, because I'm not a big fan of keyboards.
What would that sound like? What would ELP sound like with Jimi Hendrix playing guitar?
I think Keith Emerson would have blown a fuse because he was such an egotist. He wanted to be the star, but. I always, the one thing that always held me back from ELP was I really don't like keyboard only bands that much.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer a guitar in there too.
Right.
Although I'll make an exception for electronic bands like Kraftwerk, who I adore. But I like to have a bit of guitar in there. And ELP, I can just hear a gap there where there should have been a guitarist.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know on the records that Greg Lake could play guitar too, but. To me that was always a lacking. I mean, 20-minute keyboard solos do start to lose their appeal for me after a while.
The other one that I always thought was one of those great what ifs was I don't know if you ever remember the project XYZ or XYZ.
I do.
Which was
maybe I'm thinking of something else, but
this was it was Chris Squire and Alan White.
Oh, I'm thinking of the same
with
one.
Jimmy Page, and they actually did record some demos.
Yeah.
That was the other thing. These guys intermingled a lot over the decades and tried out different combinations and guesting, and they always wanted to see what it sounded like with somebody else. Hey, I'll go make an album with this guy over here, this keyboard player. What's that going to sound like? Didn't always make the cut. I mean, Jeff Beck, genius that he was, there's Jeff Beck stuff remained in the can and was never released, collaborations with people. Yeah. He went, it didn't work, that kind of thing. But Hendrix, of course, you mentioned was a consummate he loved to jam. He would jam with anybody on the scene, and that's why there's millions of miles of tape in the can of him noodling, because he loved to just jam. Oh, let's just get back in the studio and give it a bit. His albums are. Two, I think, could be included. They call them psychedelic, but really they're progressive rock. It's the start of prog with guys like Hendrix, because what he did in those albums was incredible with some of the effects and production, and the themes as well. We're forgetting about the lyrical themes and the visions. Fueled by.
You imagine, you have to wonder what would he be producing in his later life, because you could feel energy. What he was doing was. Expanding.
Such a loss. Imagine what he could have done as a writer, producer, musician over the decades.
Yeah.
Who he could have worked with and imagine Jimi Hendrix and I'll say Michael Jackson, for instance. Imagine putting that kind of thing together.
Imagine Jimi Hendrix playing on Thriller.
Yeah, or Jimi Hendrix and Prince doing something, or just a million things he could have. Imagine Hendrix fronting a hard rock metal band of the 80s or 90s. Just he could have done anything. It's just such a sad loss. But I mean, we've talked a lot about the obscure stuff. I I'm a huge Genesis fan, particularly mid-period Genesis. So stuff like Trick of the Tail. I guess for me, I mean, the earlier stuff is great, but Selling England by the Pound, the last Peter Gabriel. Well, I think Lamb Lies Down on Broadway was after that, wasn't it? But the last one, Lamb is a different thing. I've got vinyl back there. But I love that period. So Selling England onwards, then Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, up to Duke. After that, I'm not so keen. But up to Duke, they were magnificent. Steve Hackett. It's a very ethereal, beautiful sound. We were talking on our show Rowdy's show earlier, about what our favorite songs of all time were. It was a question that was asked, what's your favorite song of all time now? Granny immediately answered, of course.
Yeah, you really got me.
Yeah, you really got me. I have trouble answering those questions. But I think if push came to shove, I know that one of the songs that would be included would be Afterglow by Genesis. Because I go back to that song so often and play it. So they created a very beautiful pastoral sound. It's very unique. Now everyone, probably younger people, know them as Invisible Touch and all the 80s pop hits. I love that mid 70s, early up to the 1980-ish era. Beautiful band.
One of my favorite Yes songs, and it is an obscure one. It is off Fragile, but it's South Side of the Sky.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those, it's Yes, it's all the elements are there, but it's almost like when Jan Ackerman was playing on Hocus Pocus. It was Steve Howe playing a lot harder than he normally does.
Yeah, he's got a particular style.
Capable of doing so. That just really wasn't his style. But just the riffing and the interstitial riffs that he was playing on that song, I can listen to that song on repeat all day and never get bored.
Yeah, it's the accomplishment of the musicians involved that makes it, and we all like a bit of visceral, heavy rock and roll. I mean,
I remember with
but we love that intricacy too.
The last concert I went to with my dad before he passed was Yes and Asia, and it was 2009, and Asia had just reformed with their original lineup. So it was John Wetton from UK. Steve Howe, Carl Palmer, and Jeffrey Downs. And Downs wasn't playing with Yes at that time because it was Oliver Wakeman's kid was playing because that was the Fly From Here tour. But Steve Howe played literally the entire night because he played the opening with Asia, then played a whole entire intermission on his own, and then played with Yes the rest of the night.
It's amazing what a cup of tea can do for you.
Right. Extra strong PG tips.
Extra strong PG tips. You mentioned John Wetton, of course.
Brian, I'll dig in my archives. When I hitchhiked to London in April 1967, I took some pictures. And one of the bands that was on was called Tomorrow. This is Testing
Tomorrow. Yeah.
And he was the guitarist in that band. And I have a photograph of Steve
Howe and Tomorrow, yeah. And wasn't John Wetton in King Crimson as well? John Wetton?
Yeah, he was. Yeah. Later on, like mid-70s, I think.
Yeah, he did join them for a while. I think Greg Lake was the original bass player in 20th Century Schizoid Man, that era. Well, Ian MacDonald, the Foreigner, was in King Crimson then, and then he later on formed Foreigner. But it's just so much good stuff. I mean, we'll have to do more shows like this to talk about the rest.
I definitely would love to do a part 2.
We've just scratched.
I don't know what the technological issue was, and I feel really bad that I looking up my nose.
Well, if you would just send me a first-class plane ticket, and I'll come and help you out.
Yeah, I don't know why it wouldn't work, but I apologize for that because you guys are so professional. I hope I haven't let you.
I would rather do the stories that it be technologically good. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you doing this, buddy, because we don't often get the chance to just riff like that. I know Granny and I have done a couple of shows where we've talked about this stuff, and we did the Gnidrolog show, which is on the Rock N Roll Rowdy's YouTube channel. Right. Check it out. Lots of good stuff in there, and there are more.
I do have links for both for Brian and for Alan in the
Mhm.
description. Like and subscribe to both of their channels, and of course mine.
Of course,
mine as
yes,
well.
sir.
Because I'm like a dog's hair away from monetization. So
better get
Yeah, keep it going. Keep it going. Yeah, keep
But,
going,
you know,
buddy.
this is really why I wanted to do a podcast like this, because I like talking about all forms of music. You know, so I like being
Yeah.
able to pick different genres and talk to people in those genres. You know, like I had Flawed on last week, and we were talking, you know, hip hop and sampling. And you know, I had 32 Flavors of Nick Weiser on, and we were just talking classic metal from the 70s and 80s. You know,
My buddy Nick, my
and
brother.
so I love being able to talk just music, because I don't really see a lot of shows like this that have a more breadth of options when it comes to the musical genres. They're very niche and focused, and that's probably to their betterment, because they can get better, you know, audience.
It's
thing. But
true. If you put yourself in a niche, you get promoted more by the algorithms, and
Yeah.
you get known for that. I can't do that. I like to do different stuff. Yeah.
you know,
But CJ,
I'm
what
with
you're saying is exactly what that was like in London. Like we go out one night, we might see the Sock Machine. The next night might be a rock band, Jeff Beck. Then we go and see a jazz concert, and they were doing a suite about landing on the moon. And then everything was crossing and mingling, and that was part of the experience of it. When I was with Bandograph Generator, we would do concerts in Europe. You never knew what the other acts were going to be on the bill. And if you did a TV show, you never know. So one night there was a duo, piano and violin, playing Eric Satie and Debussy sonatas.
Beautiful. Yeah.
That
Beautiful.
stuff. And I'm with Bandograph Generator, this great hairy monster, setting up the gear. And I'm talking to the two musicians, the real musicians, and they gave me a copy of their album. And I'm going like, I'm in heaven.
Have you still got it?
I've still got it, of course. Oh yeah.
Great.
So
Good to
that
hear.
was like everything was crossing over, and I think talking about things without too many boundaries is always good.
Mm-hmm. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate both of you taking time out of your day to talk to me and to my pokey little music program here. And we are going to definitely do this again, because I
should
so much, you know, we could deep dive on this subject, and it's again a genre I'm very much a fan of. Especially as a classically trained musician, I've studied, you know, classical. I mean, all these different, you know, classical, Renaissance, you know, styles of music, and the timelessness of those is what I feel prog rock will eventually become, because those albums are timeless. I mean, some of the sounds may sound dated just by instrumentation, but the musicianship and the themes are eternal.
Yeah, well said, mate. Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, the beauty of prog is it encompasses a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There is rock in there, there is jazz in there, there is classical in there. It's all in there. There's something for everybody. You even had guys like Steve Hillage doing punk albums. You know, it was so beautiful. It's a wide genre, and it's a welcoming genre. Dive on in.
Yes.
If you've never got to listen to prog, go listen to some prog. Get the gateway stuff.
You modern Zoomers, grab an edible, put on an album, and just let your mind go.
Yeah, put a Yes album on, put Trick of the Tail by Genesis on. Hell, Pink Floyd you could even put on, you know. So the gateway bands. The gateway bands.
Well, gentlemen, again, thank you. As a programming note, next week we have DJ Access will be joining us, and we'll be talking about digital music. And then the next week we've got the Gamersician, and we're going to be talking about music streaming. So we definitely we're gonna keep this show going. And again, like, subscribe to both Brian and to Alan. Like and subscribe to the Forgotten OneCast. Definitely share on all your multimedia platforms, whatever you're using. You know, X, gonna give it to you, Facebook, whatever it is. And just as I always say, keep making music.
Yeah.